Hello there, and welcome to Exam AZ-900, Microsoft Azure Fundamental Study Guide. This is episode 21 of 50, Azure Management Tools. My name is Tim Warner, and I'm happy and grateful to be your instructor. Today's objective from the AZ-900 objective domain begins with describe core solutions in Azure Management Tools, then describe Azure Management Tools, and finally describe the functionality and usage of the following Azure Management Tools: Azure PowerShell, Azure Command Line Interface, and Azure Cloud Shell. Go to timw.info/AZ900 to download the exam blueprint and basically an episode guide to this series. Let's proceed. Before we tour the major Microsoft Azure management tools, I want to say a word about the Azure Resource Manager REST API. If you've been following this series sequentially, then you know the basics of what a REST API is. A REST API is where you perform CRUD operations programmatically over HTTPS. HTTPS is the secure version of the Hypertext Transfer Protocol, and CRUD stands for Create, Read, Update, and Delete. Fundamentally, Azure Resource Manager is a fabric of application programming interfaces. So no matter which specific tool you use, under the hood, those commands are being translated into HTTPS requests. All right, so you need to understand from a ground level, all Azure tools are abstractions built on top of the ARM REST API. If you look on the right-hand side of this slide, you can go into the Microsoft Docs and visit the REST API browser to actually inspect and work with the REST API directly. You can add tools to your web browser like Postman to actually interact with Azure Resource Manager directly using raw HTTPS requests. A software development kit, or SDK, is a set of libraries. There's a bunch of them for Microsoft Azure that give your developers an abstraction over the ARM REST API, but also SDKs tend to provide additional value and convenience, retry logic, error correction, etc., that's built, again, on top of the REST API. The languages that Microsoft supports for the Azure SDKs are .NET, which is Microsoft's own runtime, it makes sense, Python, Java, JavaScript, PHP, and Go. So the idea with Azure is that no matter what your development stack, you should be able to find an Azure SDK that works for you. And in today's Microsoft, you can run a completely open source Linux-based application in the Microsoft Azure Cloud. That never ceases to tickle me, given that I've been a Microsoft specialist over 20 years. I never thought this would be the case. Let's look at Azure PowerShell and the Azure CLI. Both of these are cross-platform command line tools that you can install locally on Windows, Mac OS, and or Linux computers. Before the introduction of the .NET Core and cross-platform Azure PowerShell, or just cross-platform PowerShell to begin with, the Azure CLI was the main choice if you were not a Windows user and you wanted to do scripting and command line automation with your Azure subscriptions. But nowadays, they're really equal citizens. Which one you choose is really going to just be your comfortability. I have many friends and colleagues who are split between Azure PowerShell or Azure CLI, whereas others prefer one over the other. Common things I hear about the Azure command line interface is that it's fast, but the command syntax is proprietary, so you have to learn a separate syntax to do Azure CLI work. Whereas Azure PowerShell, the PowerShell language and syntax is standardized across any application or domain you're working with, but at least developers tell me they find Azure PowerShell's quite verbose. I suggest that if you are an IT professional or a developer, you get some experience with both of these environments. And again, what's so cool about having a command line interface into Azure is that you can write scripts to automate just about any kind of administrative, management, or development or maintenance task within Azure. And it can be a lot faster, oftentimes, to just open a command prompt to execute a command like stopping a virtual machine, let's say, as opposed to logging into the Azure portal and authenticating and clicking and clicking and clicking. And then there's the Azure Mobile App. This is essentially a portable version of the Azure portal. It doesn't include all of the Azure portal features, but it has the most popular ones. The application is available both for iOS as well as Android operating systems. And the main reasons why I, for instance, use the Azure Mobile App is to give me quick heads up on things like service health. Is Microsoft having a problem on their side that could be affecting some of my resources, as well as things like powering off VMs? If you forget to turn off a VM or a cluster, you can just whip out your phone, authenticate into your Azure environment using the mobile app, tap a couple times and you're finished. Believe it or not, you can access Azure Cloud Shell from within the mobile app. It's kind of funny to think of that, given although cell phones have never been bigger than they are, it's still not a full screen experience, but you can in fact run Azure PowerShell or Azure CLI from your phone if you really need to. If you're wondering what Azure Cloud Shell is, I haven't formally defined it yet. Hang on, because I'll incorporate it into our demo. All right, in this demo, I'm going to give you a whirlwind high-level introduction to the major Azure tools. What you're looking at right now is my Edge browser, but I'm at portal.azure.com/app/download. This will take you to a download page, believe it or not, for a Windows desktop version of the Azure portal. If you click download, it comes down as a small executable that you install. You might be thinking, why in the world, Tim, if I'm on a Windows 10 workstation, let's say, would I want to have the Azure portal outside of a browser running in an application? That's what you're seeing right here. This is the desktop app. Notice I can drag it around, minimize, maximize it, etc. I did scoff at this idea, but now I'm a fan because the desktop app version of the Azure portal, because the code and bits are running locally on your machine, you're going to find that it's really fast. So for instance, notice that as I type, I immediately get help as far as the service list and marketplace links and documentation links. I'm a big fan of this, so I wanted to show it to you. Now, if you look on the toolbar in the Azure portal, we've got what's called the Azure Cloud Shell. What this is a browser-based environment. Notice that you can choose either Bash, which is the command interpreter used on Linux and Unix, or we could go to Azure PowerShell directly. I'm going to choose that. And when you start Cloud Shell for the first time, you have to mount a storage account. And you can either just choose your subscription and click Create Storage, or you can go to Show Advanced Settings and you can specify exactly where you want the storage account to be and what file share you want to use. I'm going to hide advanced settings and just let Azure create a new storage account for my environment. And the value proposition of that is you can store your scripts and your work files in your own home folder. And then from wherever you are in the world, you can log into Cloud Shell and you have all of your stuff. It's stored in a storage account, in a general purpose Azure storage account, specifically in the file service as a file share. Once you're in the Cloud Shell environment, and it automatically authenticates you as the account that you're logged into the portal with, so that's another advantage. You've got access to all of the Azure PowerShell tools, the Azure CLI, and a whole bunch of other development and management tools that Microsoft stocks this command line interface with. And you can change, for instance, the text size, as you can see here. And if you want to connect to your file share to upload your scripts, etc., you can just open this menu, Manage File Share, and that takes you directly to the share that stores your home folder environment. Let me maximize the screen here and let me boost the font one more level. Go to text size large. Let's say we wanted to create a new resource group using PowerShell. Well, we can do get command. The PowerShell commands always start with a verb, then there's a hyphen, and then there's a noun. And let's say we're looking for commands whose name includes resource group. I'm just throwing stars around it just as a way to do a kind of a fuzzy search. And we see new AZ resource group. So if we want to create a new AZ resource group, how do we do that? Well, we can use get help. And the name of the command in this case is new AZ resource group. And I'm using tab completion as well. Get help is going to give you a description of the command and its associated help. And if you add, let me up arrow and do dash examples, you can get some examples of how to use the command. And normally they start simple and then get more complex. Let's look at example 1 here. So it looks like new AZ resource group. You give it a name and you give it a location. Fine. So let me CLS to clear the screen. and I'll do New AZ Resource G tab, and I'll call this AZ-900A, and for location, I will choose South Central US. There it is. See how fast that was? Now, to do the Azure CLI, I suggest that you start off in interactive mode because it's much easier to learn the language. Normally, the Azure CLI is a non-interactive environment, and by interactive, I mean that you're able to work on your code live. If you do AZ Interactive, that'll load an extension and put us into an environment that gives us the ability to use Azure CLI with a whole bunch of extra help added in. For example, as I start to type AZ space, notice that the interactive extension gives you autocomplete help. And the way Azure command line interface works is that every command starts with AZ, and then you go into a product. If we were going to create a storage account, I can start to type storage and then press tab to autocomplete. And now that we're within the storage resources, and you can see down below, notice that the help is automatically showing up as we're typing. Notice here within the storage context, if we want to do a storage account, I'm going to do ACC tab, and then we're asked, okay, AZ storage account, what kind of operation do you want to do? See how there's create, delete, list. I'm going to do create. And then it gives us a list of parameters, some of which are required. As you see, name and resource group are both required, and I'm sure location is required as well. Let me arrow down to see, yeah, location. Looks like it's not required, interestingly enough. So I'll do name, AZ-900, STG, and then -- resource group. Notice it even drops down values for us. We can put it in the new resource group that we created just a moment ago. And the reason why location is optional is because Azure CLI is going to assume that the storage account will be created in the same region as the parent resource group. And we could keep on going with -- to customize how we want this storage account to behave. Otherwise, the Azure CLI has a bunch of built-in default values. So I'm going to press enter, and Azure's going to go ahead and create that new storage account. And all of the properties, like I said, are just going to be picked up using pre-built defaults. Now, I want you to think of how amazing it would be if you needed to create 100 storage accounts, that you could create a script file that just has a couple lines of code and have all of those resources get created for you automatically. That's the power of using tools like Azure CLI and Azure PowerShell, because you're able to automate to that level. And here we can see a bunch of JavaScript object notation. If I continue to scroll, I can get past it. This is giving us a full dump of all of the properties of that new storage account resource that we created. Our learning resources start with the ARM-REST API. For more details on that, go to timw.info/AMT1. For the docs in Azure PowerShell, go to timw.info/AMT2. And for the Azure CLI docs, you guessed it, AMT3. Thanks so much for joining me. I appreciate you very much. Feel free to leave comments, feedback, requests here on YouTube, or you can find me on Twitter at TechTrainerTim. You can find all my Pluralsight courses at timw.info/PS, and my website is techtrainertim.com. I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson. Take care.